Hello and welcome to our first episode of In Their Own League on YouTube. Today we're joined by some of the team, and I am Joan Amenn, Editor-in-Chief. And before we get into the discussion, please like and subscribe. We have a lot more coming at you, and we can't wait to share it with you. So without further ado, let's introduce the team. Ryan, go first.
My name is Brian Skutle. I'm a contributing writer and podcaster. I also have my own website at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema podcast, where I discuss film from a lot of different angles, mostly from classic film angles, but also personal ones. And I'm also a composer that you can hear my music wherever you stream music, as well as Bandcamp.
Calum, go for it.
Hi, I'm Calum. I'm a contributing writer to In Their Own League with bylines at Film Stories, Cinerama Film, The People's Movies, and more. I'm an avid cinephile, and I love reviewing and discussing film in all shapes and sizes.
Valerie.
Yes, hi, I'm Valerie Kalfrin. I'm a contributor to In Their Own League and also a member of the Alliance of Women Film Journalists. And I've also contributed to The Hollywood Reporter and RogerEbert.com and The Guardian. In addition to being a critic, I am a script reader and do coverage for various scripts and screenwriting contests. And you can find me on Twitter at Valerie Kalfrin.
All righty. So a shout out to Brian also for composing our wonderful musical interlude as we have our intro that you just heard. So thank you, Brian, for that. Let's get into our discussion here. We're talking Mad Max evolving into Furiosa, which has been a really wild ride. Mad Max was first released as an Australian film in 1979 for the budget of, I think, approximately 300,000, and yet it grossed 8.8 million. Then we had Road Warrior 2, Mad Max 2 Road Warrior, which was a box office smash at 24 million at the time. That was quite something. Then we had the Thunderdome, Beyond Thunderdome, with the wonderful, late, much missed Tina Turner. And that grossed 36 million, which was quite something also for that time period. Now we had quite the wait for Fury Road released in 2015, and that was a mega hit at 380 million. So now we have Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, and its box office so far has been 119 million, and I got these numbers from IMDb, by the way. So let's discuss. There's been a lot of scuttlebutt already, how Furiosa was just how this was a terrible disappointment at the box office. Is that really a realistic expectation to think that Furiosa could match Fury Road in the numbers that it did? That was quite the runaway hit.
I think that we've seen a lot this summer alone with a lot of high expectations. And it's not that the films are bad. There's been a lot of have been performing bad. There's been a lot of discussion about this on film Twitter, and I still call it Twitter, but Twitter/X. A lot of the film writers have been talking about this, like, with The Fall Guy as an example. They were like, oh, kick off your summer movie season with The Fall Guy. And one writer was like, there's an argument to be made that if you did not call it The Fall Guy, you might have had more people come out to it, because nobody under 50 likely has heard of the TV show. And there is a pun for using, aside from being a stuntman, there's another punny reason and a plot reason of why he's called The Fall Guy. That plays into the story. But somebody was like, I think you could make the argument that if they had not been so wedded to perhaps saying, oh, this is built into like a previous thing, an IP, you might have had like some broader appeal. But there's also like these expectations for what it performs in its first weekend. Like it has to do these gangbuster numbers this first weekend. And there's so many factors why people may not go to the movie that first weekend. They're waiting for word of mouth. They're busy. They can't afford it at the time. They're waiting till the paycheck comes in. You know, that the theaters have to make their money back. So, I mean, even though you wouldn't be taking the family of four necessarily to see Furiosa, if you're on a date, even, you know, it's more expensive than it was before. So I think there's all these factors into it. And I don't think it's necessarily that people wouldn't want to give the movie a chance. But you know, there's also this talk about how we're seeing the results of the writers and actors strike, that eventually there was going to be a dip at the very least in the box office. There was going to be something, you know, and it just, you know, I liked the movie. Don't get me wrong. I love Furiosa as a character, and you know, for the people watching, I brought her here. See, she's another one of my favorite film heroines. But you know, I think there's all sorts of reasons why people may not have gone that first weekend, and to say, oh, it underperformed, then the narrative starts to come out, oh, it underperformed. Nobody's going to see this movie. Is it any good? There's nobody's going. It's like, I think we need to give films a little more of a chance in general. So I don't know what everybody else thinks about that. Apologies. We're new at this at the YouTube thing. So we're like, do I talk yet? Am I stepping on someone's toe?
Well, you know, it's funny because of the fact that, I mean, Joan gave us the box office totals for this franchise. And I think the thing that I think a lot of people kind of forgot with the success of Fury Road is that the original Mad Max franchise they were not massive hits. I mean, yes, the box office grew as the films went on, but that had as much to do with the films being as big a part of Mel Gibson's rise in Hollywood as it was, oh, I want to see more Mad Max. That wasn't necessarily, I mean, as much as it became an established franchise, it wasn't necessarily, I think, a big part of why the franchise continued to grow. And, you know, I mean, Mad Max and the Road Warrior were essentially, they were foreign imports. Like they were films that came over to America from Australia. I think Beyond Thunderdome was the first one that had major studio backing with Warner Brothers. And so the idea, and so I think when you have a movie like Fury Road that did as well as it did, you understand why the expectations for Furiosa were naturally going to be a bit higher. But I think the success of Fury Road, not just at the box office, but also at the Oscars, it was basically the big winner outside of winning best, with the, you know, even though it didn't win Best Picture or Best Director that year, put way too many expectations, I think, on Furiosa as a film to perform as well as it did. To Valerie's point, I do think that we are starting to see, not just because of the strikes, but I do think we're starting to see a significant shift in the way moviegoers go to see movies. And a big part of it is the theatrical window closing as much as it has. We're seeing prices rise. We're seeing how much more expensive it is to get a family or even just two people to go to the movies. And then you've got streaming, because the studios have set the expectation that, okay, in a few, in a month or two, it'll be on streaming, so you can watch it anytime you want.
I was reading.
So many different factors. There are so many different factors in this that it really is. I think it was I don't think it was necessarily realistic, but to a certain extent, I will say, even though it may not have been realistic, it's still disappointing to see that Furiosa is not really, may not have necessarily had the legs to it as it should have.
I was
Melanie, you
gonna,
gonna say something?
yeah, I'm sorry. Like I said, I mean, I
That's fine.
definitely do with this. I gotta wait to like chime in. But I was hearing it was an old interview with Matt Damon on like the hot ones where they eat the hot sauce and
Yeah.
chicken wings and talk. And he was saying that how just a lot with certain movies, and I don't know that this is necessarily the case with Furiosa, but he did say that streaming has changed a lot, which is a excellent point, because people will now wait for streaming, whereas he said that also with in terms of making your money back, you knew that if it was on DVD or Blu-ray in X amount of months, it was almost like you got a second box office. Like there were people who waited, because they also like all the features, or they wanted to own it at home, whatever reason. That he said it's like you got like a second boost out of that, and he said, and we're not necessarily getting that now when it goes to streaming, because it's not a physical copy that people are purchasing anymore. It's included in a subscription. So he said that's kind of affects like what you would call your box office numbers, so to speak. Your ultimately how much it makes.
You got something to add to that? Your thoughts?
I also think it's worth noting that a lot of films are having higher budgets as well. Like that's potentially a factor too. So rather than I forget who it was who made this point at the Oscars this year, but so rather than making say 10, $20 million films, instead of making one $200 million film. And I think, unless my facts are wrong here, I think the only film last year that was over 200 million that made a real profit last year was Guardians of the Galaxy. Because sure, Barbenheimer both did incredibly well at the box office, but that was arguably due to kind of the memification of those movies coming out on the same day. Whereas, oh yes, that's right, it was a Cord Jefferson from American Fiction. That's right, Valerie. So I think that's potentially something where people in studios are putting their focus on big theater-going pieces, which I've got no problem with. A lot of them are quite fun, but it means putting a lot of investment in those films rather than diversifying what we could potentially be getting as a theater experience. That, whatever your opinion on streaming, that does offer a lot more choice, arguably too much choice. So that's people are gravitating more towards that rather than the cinema experience.
I also think that the nature of the film, and this struck me when I saw it, I loved the film, but I loved Fury Road. And to me, this was almost like the extended release of one of the Lord of the Rings films, where we got answers to questions that were raised with Fury Road that we were left wondering about. So can an extended release film really do as well as what I would consider the original, which is kind of backwards because Fury Road came after in the timeline to Furiosa. But Furiosa clears up a lot of questions, doesn't it, that we were left with, because of course Miller does not believe in a lot of dialogue in his films, which we'll get to. But my thinking is that ultimately maybe Miller could splice these two together the way Godfather 1 and Godfather 2 it were eventually. And it would be that could be a re-release that could be really a mega hit, because the two of them do belong together. And to me, it was like, oh, he went back and thought, oh, you know what? I need to write this. And because he said he actually wrote it first before he did Fury Road. And maybe they just really should have been ultimately winding up together. As a DVD, Valerie, it probably would be special feature, or maybe even an extended version of Fury Road. But we have Furiosa as this kind of strange creature that is a standalone film, but maybe not. I think maybe
Yeah.
that affected the box office too. People saw it and said, huh, they'll go back and rewatch Fury Road, and maybe that's just too much effort to put into seeing a film. Maybe I'll wait for it to come out on
Yeah.
streaming, because then I could watch the two of them together. Which maybe would have been perhaps a better plan to begin with.
Yeah, that's interesting that he wrote Furiosa first, but honestly, that does kind of make a lot of sense, because it's like, well, because then you find out how that character gets to the point she is in Fury Road, and then you can tell this story afterwards. That actually does make a lot of sense. I didn't really think about the Godfather 1 and 2 comparison, but that is a very good one, I think. And the idea, especially with how much the third act of Furiosa basically is like literally telling us how it gets exactly into Fury Road, which is one of the things I'm not a huge fan of with the new film. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, knowing that this one was written first, that honestly makes a lot of sense why I would feel like that would be an important way of bridging the two together.
I mean, it was a creative choice, and I respect the creative choice. I just think that as far as box office numbers, maybe that was a little off-putting to people to say, oh, now maybe I'll wait for it to be streamed, because then it's really kind of a part one of a double feature. Or eventually it should be one film, which would be incredible, but maybe that's what Miller has in mind for the future. Who knows? Anyway, speaking of splicing things together, Miller's wife, Margaret, so she won an Oscar for Fury Road, much deserved. But she was quoted as saying she took on the editing job because if a guy did it, and this is a quote, it would look like every other action movie. And honestly, I can't think of any George Miller film that could be confused with any other action movie. The man has a style. But apparently, if you want to keep that style, you bring your wife in and help you out with it. And it was a winning combination. But do you think that's there's a certain grain of truth in that? I mean, I love the fact that she was brought in and she took it on, and she took on two of the films. She wasn't deterred with the the immensity of Fury Road. She came back for a second helping. Do you think that if another editor took this on, it would look on like any other film?
I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because to your point, George Miller basically is unlike any other action director. I think one of the ways to look at that is you look at what Thelma Schoonmaker brings to Scorsese's films, and you see that there's a way of them working together to create those sequences, whether it's the boxing sequences in Raging Bull, whether it's the frenzy at the very end of Goodfellas, whether it's the scenes of montage and pain in something like Killers of the Flower Moon. There's something unique about that collaboration that I think, and I mean, you can also look at Jennifer Lane, who just won an Oscar for Oppenheimer. I do think that female perspective does make a difference, and especially with what we've seen in Fury Road and Furiosa. The fact that, and let's be honest, Furiosa, the main character in both of those movies. I mean, yeah, it's Mad Max Fury Road, but Max is a supporting character in that movie. And I mean, I think it does matter to a certain extent, but I think one of the things I remember reading about the way they were looking at Fury Road as in terms of editing was they were thinking very much mathematically when they were editing that movie. And you can kind of see where they're coming from in the way, in the different rhythms that the action plays in. And it's funny, I was testing content at a theater recently, and I put on Furiosa in order to do that. And I got into watching the very beginning of Furiosa again, and I forgot just and that opening scene where Furiosa's mother's chasing her and trying to catch her is just absolutely riveting. And it goes into another thing that we will talk about later, that I think is a big part of why the action in these movies work. But you can see the ways in which the editing is unlike anything that other filmmakers would do. Like, you're not going to get this type of editing in a Michael Bay film. You're not going to get this type of editing. You wouldn't get this type of editing in a Richard Donner film. You wouldn't get this type of editing in a lot of different action, or even in a John Woo film. As great as he is, he just doesn't think about action in the same way George Miller does. And yeah, I mean, I think especially with Furiosa and Fury Road, having that female perspective as an editor is a huge reason why these movies work as well as they do.
I saw I think also, like you, as you're talking about the collaboration with that Martin Scorsese has with his editor. Margaret Sixel is as his wife, she kind of knows him on a whole other level.
Yeah.
And she said in this IndieWire story that as his editor, she says, I am in a unique position as I can be honest without fear of being fired.
Definitely an advantage.
I think the fact that they obviously have a working relationship where they respect each other's opinion and their skill set. That she can say, she's probably got a better way to tell him why something doesn't work. That and can relate it, than perhaps someone else would. And she said that she just constantly questions things where question each moment, and that over time the cut grew tighter and more muscular, and she wanted to get to the moment where Max breaks free, because he's got that kind of that garden pool muzzle on. So she's like, we knew we couldn't keep him in that, for a significant amount of time. So she wanted to get to that pretty quick. And she was mindful of moving the story along and just not getting caught up in what's visually interesting footage. So I think she does have, she does have an advantage of just like this relationship with George Miller, where they know each other pretty well, and she can say what would work in the film. But I've watched people on YouTube dissect the movie, and not the whole movie, but just certain things. Like there's that one sequence with the bikers where they're jumping down and then jumping over the tanker, and they give a lot of credit to Margaret's editing, because it says you are well oriented the whole time, and it's like it anticipates, like she understands where your eye is going to go and where your brain's going to go, and she makes sure that she puts the next shots wherever they are, so that like when the person's jumping across the tanker, they're dropping these explosives, where they're going to end up. And
mean feat, which is no mean feat. I mean,
it's very impressive. And and even when Furiosa was being released, Steven Soderbergh had a wonderful quote. It doesn't speak to the editing, but I think it ties into that. He talked about the ability to stage well being a skill and a talent that he
Mhm.
values above almost everything else. And he said having watched Mad Max Fury Road, he said, I could tell you I couldn't direct 30 seconds of that. He says, I don't understand how they're not still shooting that film, and I don't understand how hundreds of people aren't dead.
Yeah.
I have to agree with that last part.
Yeah. So that quote, of course, like was going on, like the screenshot of that was going all over among the film fans online, and because yes, it's a tip of the hat to the movie, and and Furiosa does have this scene. I think overall the movie Furiosa as a movie, which we could talk about uh, like in a moment, but I think as a movie it has a slower pace. Like Fury Road, I feel like you're on the road and you're off and running. Like the whole thing is just like a chase. Even when it has these quieter moments, it's got this almost like this adrenaline that keeps going all the way through. And I feel like Furiosa is a slightly quieter movie. It does have chases, but it's a little more introspective. I wouldn't quite call it a character study, but you're getting more of this character, and you're getting things that set up and pay off in Fury Road that give more resonance to things she might say or do in Fury Road. And so but they do have this long action sequence again on the war rig, where even though you don't have motorcycles jumping across the front of the road, there's like a parachute, there's all sorts of wild stuff going on, and again you can follow everything to a T, and it's suspenseful, and she's going to get out of it because she's alive in the later movie, but it's still like fun to see like what she does and how she does it, and how there's like another character who, again, like with her and Max, is impressed by what a good fighter she is, and instantly like cedes some trust to her in that moment, not knowing like where she's like a stowaway on the rig, not to spoil anything great, but then she pops up and starts helping things out. And so the another character just like instantly like trusts her and knows like she's a good person. So it's like that he can trust her. And so it's a neat character thing too. So, and as far as just like an action sequence, it's a good action sequence. So I think that there's that collaboration, like I said, because they're spouses, but and also because she tries to make sure that things serve the story.
Yeah, what do you want to add to that?
I think it's quite interesting as well that the script could probably play a factor in this too, because I don't know what the script of Furiosa was like, but certainly with Fury Road, it was arguably more of a storyboard artist script than it was an actual script. It's 500 pages long, and so much of it is taken up with illustrations of what they want. So it's all you can argue. There's almost no way to distort what George Miller was after. Certainly with that, and I certainly can't think of any other script that has been conceived in that manner. But yeah, of course, I do agree with what the chat is saying, that the fact that husband and wife are a duo working on this, and they are a duo outside of film as well, that's certainly going to be very, very beneficial too. But I also think as well, the fact that Fury Road and Furiosa are both inherently feminist stories, you need, I mean, not to sound a certain way, but like, you need more than just a male perspective. You do need female perspectives in order to bring out the best in what its aims are. And I think Margaret certainly does go a long way in bringing that to the forefront.
Absolutely, which brings us to our next point. According to Screen Rant, Miller brought in Eve Ensler, who is the author of the Vagina Monologues, to consult and help develop the female roles for Furiosa, because it's not just Furiosa, right? We have other females in this cast. We have other women in this cast, and she is, to continue Fury Road, helping to liberate the wives of the bad guy, Immortan Joe. And we have these women who have experienced trauma. To a certain extent, so is Furiosa. And how they deal with their trauma and help each other is a big part of Furiosa. And that is also, I think, something that was missing with Fury Road, in that you see her help them, but you're like, let's go here. So it's the backstory, like you said, Valerie, it slows down the action a little, but it's necessary, because now you finally get to develop these characters more. You get to understand where they're coming from and really the extent of their trauma, how they react to that. Personally, one of my favorite characters is the elderly lady with the seed bag. I call her the seed lady. Love her. Loved what they did with her. Such a character that embodies hope in this film, which, remember, this is a dystopia. And here we are with this lady clinging to this bag of seeds. And I just thought that was a beautiful, beautiful touch. And so glad that wasn't edited out for sake of action. So yeah, some really important choices were made there. But I think that this leads into our discussion. Well, how do we get from Max to Furiosa? How do we embrace this transition? And we see that with who Miller was willing to bring on, right? It was, like you say, Calum, it wasn't just a male perspective. He was willing to open up and say, let's bring in these other perspectives. Let's bring in my wife and her perspective, how this is going to be edited. Let's bring in this consultant, because he introduced these elements into the story, and he felt the need to do justice to the characters. I think that's very important, especially for Miller, who is known for action films, as distinctive kind of action film. He really took that next step, and I'm very impressed with that. Was very struck by how he opened this up and said, oh yeah, well, we started here, but now we're here, and we're going to embrace that fully and make this I think that's a really unique thing as far as a director, to say, I'm going to evolve this film, and it's not going to be locked into, can we make the case that maybe a male action film would sell more, be more embraced by the public? But no, we're not. We're going to go here, and we're going to say, Furiosa, you're the star now, starting with Fury Road. You've actually eclipsed Max, and we're making you this, and we're going to take that further. And we're going to do, our next film with you as the star as well. That to me was very unique, even in filmmaking choices, as far as a director, where he's willing to go.
I think with these films, and my husband loves these movies too, and he has pointed out that Max is always kind of like the lone wanderer. Like, he stumbles into these situations, except perhaps arguably the very first movie where we meet him. But he's kind of like he just kind of is sticking to himself, trying to survive, and he runs across something. And then he's if he were in the Old West, he'd be like the gunslinger who's kind of out there by himself, and then he comes upon the town. So, in a way, Mad Max Fury Road does follow that kind of mold, because he gets caught up in this thing. It just happens to be this type of where he almost meets his match. He meets somebody who's also kind of like a warrior like he is, and he decides to help out. But he's very much he kind of always kind of has to decide that he's going to help out and do something. And I think in this landscape, the fact that that there are people who are resources, like we've seen this type of thing. If you watch any kind of dystopian story, you see this before, that, you know, the world goes to hell and sometimes people really go off the rails. And the resource has, in these movies, has always been like gas and stuff to make the vehicles go. And it's like a found world where they're like putting together things to keep everything up and running. But if you look at um like even a Quiet Place, because I know we got the prequel to that coming out, but I remember being impressed by the Quiet Place Part 2. You know, there were people who you wanted to kidnap other people and make them like their servants or slaves. So the fact that you've got this society of a Morton Joe where he's built himself up with these acolytes who are willing to do anything for him, and he's got the women who are his property. But in the real world, we have people who are victims of human trafficking, which is why he brought Eve Ensler in, because he's realized that was the story he's essentially telling, is a human trafficking story. You know, I love how the wives have this revelation and they say, we're not things. And more to like the editing point, I remember I read something, I think it was in Bright Wall Dark Room when Fury Road came out, and it was a male writer, but Fury Road had come out, I don't know if it was the same time, but it was around the same time as one of the Transformer movies, because the pregnant wife in Fury Road is played by Rosie Huntington-Whiteley. And so she was in one of the Transformers films. And so this writer was talking about the gaze, and he talks about how Michael Bay follows her up the stairs, and he has the camera like up her backside as she's going up the stairs. He says, but even in the film like Fury Road, they're not things. Even though you know that in the construct of the story, they're his harem and his property, and they're there to be breeders. They're never shot that way.
Right.
And so he did this whole piece. It was wonderful to read because he focused on the actress and said, here are these two movies she's in. And one looks at her this way, even if it's not the whole film, it does that, but it has a moment that it does that. And this whole other film where her character's set up to be a thing, but she's not a thing. Like they, you know, and that in and of itself, I think was, you know, a fascinating comparison. Maybe goes back to the editing and the shooting of it too. But you know, it is like Calum said too, it's a very feminist story. But I think in a way it's a natural story of like the end of the world, that they're going to look at certain people as having more value, because that's what we do nowadays when the society hasn't gone to pot. So, you know, it's kind of nice to see that even if that happens at the end of the world, that people, you know, like Furiosa and like Max say, you know, this is wrong, and we're not going to stand for this anymore.
Well, let's remember too, Furiosa isn't just an action hero like Max. She has a prosthetic. And she still kicks butt like Max. She can keep up with Max. And that, to me, was just fantastic. This is not just a woman. This is a woman who in our society would be considered disabled.
Yes.
Not likely. She is keeping up. She is freeing these other women, and she has a mechanical arm. And well, that's not slowing her down at all, is it? So I think that just was so amazing, because it's almost like Miller said, oh, and by the way, we're going to crank up the stakes just a little bit more. Not only does she have to free these women in this dystopian society that has devolved to the point where women are now property, but we're going to chop off her arm too. And we're going to show you that a woman can do as much as a male hero, but with one arm literally missing, or not tied behind her back, but one arm missing, right? It was just a great, great touch, I think, to just ratchet that up, how much she has to overcome, because she has her own trauma, right? I mean, she was trafficked as a child.
Mm-hmm.
She has her own trauma to have to deal with, and and her society in that beginning sequence, Brian, that beginning sequence is like one of my favorites in the film. Really, you see almost that she comes from a matriarchal society. It's implied
Mm-hmm.
that this matriarchal society that she was trafficked from. So that trauma of being ripped away from that and trying to get back to that, that all evolves into her relating to the women who are trying to break free of being pretty much property. And so, yeah, it was a slower story, but what was beautiful was that, the story did not get sacrificed for the sake of the action, which was, I really think, to the credit of not only Miller, but, that he knew who to go to help him with that. You could say, oh, yeah, kudos to the director, but the director is only as good as willing to have that dialogue, right? Willing to say okay, where do we want this to go, the story to go, and be open to that. So, yeah, way to go, Miller, for that. So, which brings us to our last point. Very few lines of dialogue in Fury Road, in Furiosa. Poor Anya is looking scout. She's scowling, she's angry, she's keeping up with the villain Demento and kicking butt, but she hasn't much to say. Do you think it's easy for the audience to accept her as an action hero because she doesn't have that much dialogue? Because we're swapping out Max for her, basically, in Furiosa and in Fury Road. Is it easier to accept because you could just turn off the dialogue, basically, and just follow this along as a silent film? Which, Brian, you and I at some point will discuss. And is it easier to follow that action and accept her as a hero, since she doesn't have much to say, and it's very clear, even without dialogue, what her objectives are?
I don't know that I would necessarily say it makes it easier for her to become the hero. I think it is important to have that transition because of the fact that, to what Valerie said earlier, like, Max is basically the gunslinger, the man with no name, essentially. And I think if you're going to go with that archetype, I think being able to write Furiosa in a way where her actions are as impactful as what words that she does say is important. I do truly believe that. But I think it's also in keeping with what has been established in this world in general. And I love that. The thing that I love about this movie, and I think the thing that I love that Miller was so able to do with this movie, with Fury Road and Furiosa, is transition away from Max as the main protagonist, which breaks a lot of rules in modern franchises. I think one of the things that is really unfortunate in modern franchise thinking is that this idea that you have to be following the same characters throughout the world. I think that, and sometimes obviously that makes sense with, like, Indiana Jones, or if you're following a particular Marvel character. But I think there are some franchises where if they had expanded the idea of this idea of, well, we don't have to follow these characters every single time, I think they'd be improved. I hope Star Wars is starting to finally break out that. But the one that I've always felt is most egregious with this is Pirates of the Caribbean. Because, I mean, the first one is wonderful. I love the first movie. I'm not as much of a fan of the sequels because of the fact that it's the same 4 characters throughout all of the movies, and we're not really getting hints of times of a larger world beyond these characters, but we're not getting enough of them. And I mean, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Furiosa is the fact that it's not about the same character. Yes, there are some of the same characters that play in this movie, but Dementis and Furiosa are your protagonists in here, are your main characters in here. And it's just something that is it's exciting to see, because I think that the thing that ultimately what Miller's trying to get to in this franchise is the idea that a world like this, the world is basically going to test you until you crack. And how you react to that is going to define you from here on forward. In Road Warrior and Beyond Thunderdome, we see different ways in which Max reacts to the ways his character cracks at the end of the first movie. In Furiosa, we're getting an idea of who Furiosa is and why she becomes the character she became in Fury Road, and it's wonderful.
Kelly, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I think the worst people into there are probably going to be annoyed at Furiosa being a female, no matter what, no matter how they went about it, just because they've already made their minds up in that regard. But I do think the lack of dialogue for Furiosa was made female is quite beneficial for this film, because cinema is inherently a visual medium, and for several decades we didn't have any dialogue at all. We only had visuals and music to work with. But I do think having that lack of dialogue, at least from Furiosa, at least kind of helps see the parallels between her and the people around her, who are in a way much more fine-tuned to the environment around them. Like, one of my favorite elements of the film is the parallels between Furiosa and Dementis. Like, both of them have gone through really traumatic things of the loss of their families, but they've both reacted to the same trauma very differently. Dementis has kind of embraced his worst elements and become this tyrannical warlord, whereas Furiosa is gradually learning from the people around her, and rather than give in to apathy like Dementis does, starts to kind of sort of sympathize and empathize with the people around her, especially the women who go on to become Immortan Joe's wives against their will. And so it's from learning that empathy and ultimately rejecting the vengeance that Dementis seems to constantly be seeking but not gain any kind of value from, that she grows to become the person that she is in Fury Road. And, you know, stuff like that is something I really eat up. Like, I've written about sort of the problematic elements of lone hero tropes before for the site. So stuff like that, just, I can really sink my teeth into things like that.
I was thinking, to a couple of points to follow up from you both. Like, we watched the series Fallout on Amazon Prime, which which I think, was excellent. And as my husband again has been a big Fallout video game fan for years, and so I'm kind of aware of the world and the characters. But the fun thing about that series was it wasn't set with particular characters from the game. It's in the world of the game. And so you could follow like these different characters, like Walton Goggins' Ghoul.
Mm-hmm.
And you could, and the different people, they're from different factions that people might be familiar with from the video games. But they're not like, oh, they're playing such and such person from, Fallout 3 or Fallout 4. They're within the world. They got the world right, which is why I think like and that gave them some freedom. And so the world of Mad Max is so huge, and we've just basically seen like Max the lone gunslinger, what he's run across, and so I would love it if we had things that were set in this world where we'd see these other societies. Like, one of the neat things about um, about Fury Road was that you heard about these other communities, like the Bullet Farmer,
Mhm.
and and they're in charge. They're like they've somehow like they've some who knows what they used to do before the world went to hell, but now now they're like the boss, and they've got these the ways that they've are head of these different communities, and it was all like talked about like this is the way it always is, and we didn't need to know backstory of those people, and in a way that was cool. I liked finding out more about Furiosa, and I do think Anya Taylor-Joy did a good job. I loved Charlize Theron. When I first saw Fury Road in the movies, my husband and I went, and I started to tear up when I thought she was going to die. I was like, please don't kill her off because I love her so much. Like I've never like since Aliens, I hadn't seen it like a female character that I had just like on screen like that I just like instantly love. And I was thinking, please don't die. Oh my God, she's gonna die. And you can see the way Tom Hardy plays it. He doesn't want her to die either. And that's
Mhm.
like when he tells her his name's Max, because he hasn't said that the whole movie. Because she's, I think she asked him what to call you, and he doesn't say anything. She says, "Okay, look, fool, here's what you're gonna do," But then by then, that's when he tells her, "But my name's Max." And you could see that he wanted her to live. He wanted to save her. So would have loved seeing Charlize Theron again. I did have a little bit of a mental shift because they're different in age. So she doesn't be younger, and she doesn't have the same build as Charlize Theron, even though she shaved her hair and she put the machine grease on over her eyes and stuff, and she kind of like her cadence of her voice she tried to match, so it wasn't so much like so you were seeing the same person. But I do think she did a good job in general with her performance. She's got these like hugely expressive eyes, and almost like an anime character to come to life. And so I think as a performer she can do a lot without having to say a lot. And I think the dialogue that they do use in some parts really serves it well. It's not hitting you over the nose, or excuse me, over the head. I was trying to say on the nose dialogue, but I came out wrong. But like toward the end with there's a scene where Chris Hemsworth plays this beautifully, where he talks about how like so much vengeance that you want, and it's just going to eat you up, and that's what it's happened to him. And like as much as he tries and as brutal as he gets, it never takes the pain away. Like you could kill all these many people, you're never going to be satisfied. And I thought that was just a wonderfully humanizing thing for him to say.
Mhm.
And I just like kind of, so I think that the balance between dialogue and not dialogue in the movie works well. I don't know if it helps necessarily to help the audience as a transition from a masculine lead in Max to Furiosa, but um we have this character in this movie called the History Man. He's like the storyteller.
Mhm.
And somebody pointed out that if you look at these as stories and like an oral history come to life, then it doesn't matter if you have Mel Gibson versus Tom Hardy, or if you have Charlize Theron versus Anya Taylor-Joy, because it's somebody else is telling the story,
Mhm.
and it's how they're describing their exploits and what they do,
Mhm.
which I thought was really cool. You know,
That is
like
cool.
imagine it as like a oral history, all these movies.
That is very cool. That's a very cool, interesting point. And honestly, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but that's a really interesting point to leave on too, because as oral history, well, what will happen with civilization falls? We will probably only have oral history to carry on what happened in the past. That's an interesting point. Anyway, thank you very much, Valerie, Calum, Brian, for being with us today. Thank you all for listening. We will have a lot more coming back at you, and thanks everyone for taking time out and discussing Fury Road and Furiosa. Hopefully more to come from George Miller.